I'd like to now open the panel discussion at this special session entitled Fostering Cooperation and Non-Weaponization in Space. Space activities have become more complex and intertwined into our daily lives. Beyond the traditional space powers, some 60 governmental entities as well as commercial and academic operators are now in space. The US and Russia still have the foremost military and civilian space capabilities. But other countries, I think notably China, are making steady and important advances in their space capabilities. I think it's worth noting here that the use of space for military purposes does not necessarily mean the use of space weapons. And space weapons do not necessarily mean weapons in space. We're going to discuss different forms as well as interpretations of space security. And I think the important part of today's discussion is to try to find what common ground can we identify and what principles and behavioral norms should govern space. What should be the most urgent priorities in the pursuit of secure and safe operational space environment? These and other questions will be illuminated by our distinguished panelists. I'd like to now introduce our speakers. You can find their full bios in the conference materials, so I will only point out their most distinguished and relevant affiliations relevant to this panel discussions. So to my right, we have Xavier Pasco, who is a senior research fellow at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, where he manages the Technology, Space, and Security Department. Mr. Pasco is also associate professor at the University of Marne-la-Vallée and a fellow at the George Washington University's Space Policy Institute. Welcome. Our next speaker is Mr. Bharat Gopalaswamy. He's a director of South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. His expertise is in the area of arms control, disarmament, and international security, as well as security issues in South Asia. Our third speaker, Mr. Wang Kuo-yu, is Academy Senior Fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs at Chatham House. He is likewise Deputy Director of the Institute of Space Law at the Beijing Institute of Technology and is one of the delegates representing China at the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. His expertise is in the area of space law and international governance of space activities. So I would like now kindly ask the speakers to deliver their introductory remarks, hopefully remaining within the 5 to 8 minute limit to preserve time for discussion among us all. So I would first ask Mr. Pasco to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairman. Thank you, Jenna. I'm glad to be with you today to discuss these issues related to collective space security. I think it's a very hot issue and very useful. It's very useful to have such forums to discuss these issues. And I would say that, and very briefly again, I will try to keep in 5 minutes. As you said, Jenna, I think, and as you suggested, the space landscape has been changing very rapidly for a few years. It may be undergoing more changes. It has undergone more changes recently than 40 or 50 years before. We have now almost 60 countries owning their own space assets, having at least one satellite in orbit. We must have something like 11 countries able to access space. And we have a lot of, and it's very new, a lot of new private actors, commercial operators owning also their own capabilities. And all this must fit with the existing space law, and we all know that I would say the core of the space law today is this treaty on the useful peaceful uses of outer space, dated back from 1967. And it's clear that for a few years there is a convergence on the fact that we have to maybe rethink, I would say, the global procedures, principles behind the collective activity in space. We have more and more satellites, we have more and more debris also. And there has been new attempts from a number of countries to, I would say, impose themselves in the realm of space security and space, I would say, in the domain, in the military space domain. So there has been a number of initiatives, as you all know, and especially one that has been pushed by the European Union, which is this proposal for an international code of conduct for space. And we have had a recent event in the United Nations with the presentation of the principle of these codes in the United Nations General Assembly. We also have a proposal, both from China and Russia, to promote a treaty this time, which would prevent the use of weapons in outer space. All these initiatives have their own merits, of course, and we just realized, in fact, all of us, that it's been quite difficult to, I would say, have a common view on what space security should be and how it should be processed. If we take it's a good example to consider the code of conduct. As you may know, the code, this idea of code of conduct, both in its form and also in its principles, in its objectives, it's been challenged by a number of countries. I must say by a large number of countries, and now this is topics for discussion at the United Nations. There have been two lines of thoughts regarding this code. One about the procedure and the form of the debate. Some countries have disputed the procedure adopted for presenting the project, as well as the nature of the code itself. The European Union has favored the notion of promoting a non-binding, a non-legally binding text in the hope that this will help countries to adhering to this kind of text. Why some countries precisely oppose this notion of accepting a non-legally binding text, and as in other domains, are promoting more legally binding treaties, in fact, and text. So this is, we all agree that the main objective is to reach a state in which the collective space security will be enhanced, but the tool to address this objective, to achieve this objective, differs. About the content of the exercise, there were also discussions about the inclusive or non-inclusive nature of the code regarding the military aspects of space security. Basically, when we talk about space security, we talk about two main domains. We talk about non-intentional security issues, such as debris, such as collisions, accidental explosions, whatever. But we also address some more, I would say, intentional issues or potentially intentional issues, which are the ASAT, anti-satellite activities. A number of countries, we all know that, have activities for developing some, possibly developing, or at least for exploring the possibility of having such assets. Space, in fact, is being more and more used for its military efficiency, and of course, space has become part of, I would say, the military apparatus of the main countries. So, logically, some space systems may become targets in the future. So, of course, how to address this particular issue? Again, here, of course, the fact that we would go towards a code of conduct would highlight the notion, and non-legally binding text will highlight the notion that we're talking about security at large. And basically, we're talking about space debris, not only, but of course, space debris is part of it. It should be dealt with at the copious level. And that was, I would say, basically the project of the code of conduct, at least the framework of reflection. But of course, if we address, and the code may address this also, if we address the intentional side of it, I would say, a number of countries say, then you have to deal with the disarmament conference in Geneva, and it won't be the same communities, it won't be the same political framework that have to address this. And this is another issue that I would say of contentious discussions. So this is, I would say, in fact, these discussions only underline the ambivalent nature of the space activities. In fact, if we think about it, these debates are reflecting the dual nature of space. We all know that space systems are dual by nature. The same satellite that makes picture for civil purposes can make picture for military purposes. Of course, it won't be exactly the same performance, etc. But I mean, the techniques are quite the same. It's the same for the telecommunications, etc. And by the way, Ministry of Defense are using more and more commercial satellites for their own military purpose, even if they can sort out between their own military means and this commercial purpose. So, of course, as soon as we want to address the whole space activities in a comprehensive way, we will face this dual nature of the space activity. And so it's reflected in these debates. We have exactly at this level the same issues that, for example, military or diplomats can face when they think about planning their future space systems. We have to decide, will it be civilian, will it be military, will it be used for military purposes? We had, for example, at the EU level, this same issue with Galileo. In Galileo has been a communitary program run by the European Commission. And we all know that Galileo can have both civilian but also military uses. By the way, Galileo is not made exactly the same way as GPS. You know that GPS, for example, has been run by the DoD. There's a clear military-civilian separation here. Galileo, it's not the case. Galileo is an asset that can be used for commercial purposes, but also for governmental purposes. The public-related service, PRS, is for governmental purposes. It means both civilian and military. We're not exactly on the same line. We always tend to have this kind of issues more and more at every stage of the space activity. We have it in the diplomatic arena. It's completely normal, I would say. So, and that will end my introduction, I would say, for the debate. The title of my little text here for me was More Pragmatism for More Space Security with a question mark. It seems to me that if we take a distance from this debate, the merit of the last sequence first of this Code of Conduct event may have been to stress the need for building first confidence through increasingly shared space situational awareness systems. We need, in fact, to make sure that we all share basic technical information that will build the first step of common trust and on collective trust that will be useful afterwards to discuss and maybe to relaunch or maybe to deepen these diplomatic debates that we have right now. We need to, I would say, consolidate these diplomatic debates and maybe to remove some misunderstandings that we may have by promoting a larger data exchange, for example, information exchange about space systems. We're all concerned by space systems. Space is a globalized environment. When something happens in space, it in fact happens to everyone. And we need to make sure that we are all informed the same way about these possible events. And to me, it seems like these difficulties that we are facing now may be a good lesson for not putting the horse behind the cart, but for, in fact, starting to talk to each other in a pragmatic manner. More and more countries have space situational awareness systems. The European Union is pursuing the objective of getting equipped with such systems. The United States, Russia, China have their own systems, national systems. We need to find, maybe that could be a first step, to find a way to create links useful links between such systems at some level. It needs to be discussed. It needs to be thought about. But I think it could be a good starter in a second phase, to deepen our diplomatic. We need to build trust. We need to construct it from the start with very concrete steps. And maybe this is something that is missing right now. It's not an easy task, but this is maybe an idea for making things, knowing some progresses. Thank you. It's just an idea for the debate.
Thank you, Xavier, for your introductory remarks. And I think we can already see that the discussion on the governance of the space in the space domain is oftentimes somewhat challenging. And I think unlike the 1960s, where actually the international community in the United States and Soviet Union at the time were able to agree on an international treaty, would seem like a gold age for, let's say, treaty creations. Regrettably, today it does not seem to be the case. And as Xavier said, there are a number of proposals how to remedy that kind of situation by different proposals, but in different venues. So I think one of the things we might discuss today is actually what parts or what elements of these proposals can be agreed upon by all parties, what principles, like you said, because each of these proposals have important elements in it. So how do you unite them in some kind of agreement among the whole space community? But before our discussion, of course, I will let our next speaker to provide his introductory remarks. Mr. Gopalaswamy.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you, Javier. Both of you have made my life much easier by laying out some of the challenges. This is also, I thank the organizers for putting together a great conference, and also thank you to you all for coming to this session. It's a hard session after lunch to wake you all up. Hopefully we can provide some interesting remarks that will kickstart the discussion. In Washington, there is a saying, where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit on the aisle. So I'm sitting right to the right of my Chinese colleague. So before the overall title of the panel is Fostering International Cooperation and Leading Towards Non-Weaponization. I'd like to take a step back and explain and describe the problem in such a way that it lays out the foundation for our discussion this afternoon. So, the Chinese anti-satellite test of 2007 sparked considerable debate amongst U.S. policy planners regarding the potential vulnerability of U.S. space assets. Many scholars and analysts believe that over the last decade, China has slowly but incrementally invested in a wide range of counterspace capabilities that are in fact capable of posing threats to the United States and its allies. The concerns focuses on two issues. The first issue is what I will discuss here. The second issue, I'll save it for a debate with my friend James Acton later. The first is Chinese counterspace capabilities the concern essentially goes like this. Chinese counterspace capabilities might someday challenge the U.S. command of the commons, particularly in the area of space. This is a crucial consideration vis-a-vis Washington's conventional military operations because space assets provide the United States enormous advantages in military surveillance and other areas. The U.S. military enjoys significant qualitative and quantitative advantages over its potential rivals because of support provided by its space platforms. A vast array of imaging satellites, for example, significantly improves U.S. surveillance capabilities. The global positioning system, which Javier has detailed out, our communication satellites help the flow of information. As a result, the American ability to project power in an expeditionary force is amplified by space. They can operate in distant theaters, employing both doctrines and sophisticated equipment that rely on satellites for advanced surveillance, reconnaissance, communication, navigation, and timing data. But the U.S. space assets also represent potential vulnerabilities for the same reason, mainly because of the increasing counterspace capabilities, as our reports show. Several assessments based on publicly available information suggest that despite China's increased investments in counterspace technology, Washington still enjoys a huge advantage in conventional operations conducted with the support of space assets. Still, the primary concerns for U.S. policymakers is China's reluctance to engage fully in a rules-based world order that Washington built after Second World War, and this is what is one of the deepest concerns. They worry that China might someday exhibit unpredictable behavior, and indeed unpredictability was manifested in the ASAT test that China carried out in 2007 and in other tests in outer space since then. So the question that concerns policy debates, or the question one can find in the policy debates in Washington and elsewhere, is if you believe the current status quo in space is okay and it's good, and I'm using this very liberally, how can we maintain the United States' space dominance without provoking continuous Chinese efforts at neutralizing those advantages? The second question is, how can any further Chinese investments in counter space capabilities be neutralized so as to prevent other Asian states, such as India, from developing unilateral solutions aimed at neutralizing the Chinese threat? The third question is, how can the United States, with its leadership or with the European Union as a main facilitator role, champion the initiative and garner support for a code of conduct in a bipartisan manner in space if such an instrument promises to be ineffective in protecting space systems when they are likely to be most vulnerable, especially during a conflict scenario? The final question is, how can the United States pursue cooperation with China in space when Beijing views Washington's space dominance as its most significant threat? So where do we stand? As far as my public assessments and all the many studies that have gone on, Washington is eminently capable of dealing with the threats posed by Chinese counterspace investments through both defensive and offensive counterspace responses of its own. But this will necessarily require significant financial resources if they are to be successfully brought to fruition. Talk about funding. We've been advocating with the Congress to increase funding on space security. Suffice to say, because protecting U.S. information dominance is vital not only to securing success in war, but also to procuring that victory at the lowest cost in terms of lives and expended effort, there has been constant advocacy with the administration. The administration is entering into a lame duck presidency next year, but with the Congress to defeat counterspace initiatives. But again, what would be the consequences of further money, developing a unilateral solution, making more antidotes to neutralize counterspace capabilities? Where do we go from there, or is this what we want in terms of a desirable scenario? Unfortunately, for both the United States and the international community, in my view, there is no arms control solution available to limit the dangers posed by increase in the counterspace activities. Javier has pointed this out, there are already deep and abiding disagreements universally about what constitutes weaponization in space, which instruments ought to be considered as space weapons, and whether or how U.S. space policies have contributed to space competition. All these controversies ensure that a useful space arms control regime capable of restraining counterspace activities by any state, including China, is very far away, if it is at all possible. A policy response that I've publicly advocated in writing and briefing policymakers is that the United States, as a leader in the world and especially in outer space, must and should pursue in regards to regarding increasing investments in counterspace programs as follows. The U.S. should initiate a discussion with all spacefaring powers about the nature of emerging threats to security in space, and it should certainly engage in consultation with its friends and allies in Europe, and especially in Asia, including Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia, among others, about the challenges posed by increasing vulnerabilities in space. A conversation with China about space security must and should be carried out, and too would be worthwhile, but it should not be assumed that such discussions, no matter how intense, will produce a convergence in perceptions. The United States should also continue to monitor the ongoing discussions about the International Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities supported by the European Union. But even if these deliberations ultimately produce a document that the U.S. would find worthwhile to sign on to, it bears remembering that neither the code, nor for that matter the proposed treaty on the prevention of placement of weapons in outer space and of the threat or the use of force against outer space objects, actually addresses the problematic threats to space security by increasing counterspace investments. Regrettably, therefore, at this stage, all states, including the U.S., is condemned to manage this hazard mainly through unilateral solutions and using their own resources, because divergent political objectives and strategic constraints between the U.S. and China at this stage are too far to bridge. Thank you.
Thank you for your introductory remarks. I think that you raised two important points here. The first important point, I think, as evident from the activities in the United States, is that countries are increasingly concerned about space security activities. And for example, the United States, as we saw it, recently raised a budget for space security issues and dedicated extra 5 to 10 billion US dollars, and some say even more, to actually look into the matter of their counter-space capabilities and space security as such. I think the second important point that you raised is that space assets are of dual-use nature, and that's why the traditional arms control mechanisms are almost, I would even say, impossible to employ. For example, we have indigenous launch capabilities. We have other programs, for example, civilian programs like Chinese Shenzhou and Chang'e missions, the Tiankung space station, or the Japan's Kibo space module, or the India's Chandrayaan lunar module. I mean, these are all examples of civilian programs that can have dual-use capability, but are, of course, also about national pride and about scientific achievements. So this is on one hand. At the same time, space assets support terrestrial military operations and enable information support and command and control of forces. So at the same time, satellites, as national technical means, serve as a tool of peace, a tool of verifying treaty compliance. So all these things combined make it even more difficult to find a consensus on any kind of tool. So I will now ask Mr. Wang to provide his view, in maybe from the legal perspective. Maybe there is a way forward.
Thank you, Yana. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here and honored as well. I'm sitting to the left, the left of my Indian or American colleague here. Yeah, but I'm here just as an independent researcher, and my views in this talk just represents my own personal views, and they are not necessarily to be developed into the government's positions. So I would like to clarify this first. Since the time is limited, I, as a follow on basis of the established presentations from my colleagues, I would like to talk about the challenges and possible solutions about the fostering cooperation and non-weaponization in outer space. Since the time is limited, at the very beginning, I would like to introduce the main remarks of my presentation. As to the challenges, in my view, the challenges can be summarized as 3 limits, which refers to limited legal system, limited rules-making platform, and limited solutions to the prisoner dilemma, respectively from legal, institutional, and political perspective. And as to the solutions, the 2 key points, elements, are rules of law and cooperation. First, as mentioned by Mr. Pascal, there are already several initiatives right now under discussion. However, the process is rather slow. So it is an urgent task for the international community to establish norms of state behavior tailored to the features of self-defense in outer space, the active space debris removal, and the cybersecurity in outer space. And second, the cooperation in deep level, as my personal view, is not limited in space technology, space project, or even space norms making, but should be reflected in common rationale or philosophy through seeking the equilibrium between space control or security and the space development, the self-protection and self-restraint, the national interests and international interests. Now I would like to talk like a short introduction. So it's well recognized that the arms control in outer space together with space debris are the 2 main challenges to international community in terms of space security issues. However, in respect of space security, governance, and management, there lies consensus or process achieved in prevention of arms race in outer space, perils, than those in space debris mitigation domain. By comparison, the main challenges to space debris management might come from technical side, but to perils, they are more from political and legal side. So in this brief talk, I'd like to identify the challenges to perils, in particular with non-weaponization in outer space, and try to offer some possible solutions. As to the challenges, the first one, the limited legal system. As we know that Article 4 of Outer Space Treaty is the main base of Paris, but it just, as to me, it just sets up a very limited principle of peaceful use or the principle of arms control in outer space. It does not prohibit placement of conventional weapons in outer space and the establishment of military bases, installations, and fortifications, the testing of conventional weapons, and the conduct of military maneuvers, which are only forbidden on celestial bodies. That is, these conducts are allowed in orbit of Earth and the celestial bodies. For instance, the use of laser and the test of assets is not prohibited by Article 4 of Outer Space Treaty. In addition to deficiencies to existing legal system, there are some new challenges to Paris, such as self-defense in outer space, active space removal, the ADR, and the cybersecurity in outer space. All these either provide justifications or chances or excuses for the placement of weapons, threat, or use of force in outer space, since the line between the offensive and defensive or military and non-military just is increasingly blurring. So the relevant rules making should be taken into account. The second, limited rules making platform. Both numbers and the functions of rules making platform are limited, in my view. First, limited platform is not conducive to sufficient and timely discussion on Paris. Many delegations hold the position that the city is the only qualified platform to discuss arms control in outer space issues. Thus, some proposals innocuous, relevant to self-defense, non-weaponization, and other space security relevant issues are questioned and asked to remove back to the city. Second, there are lacking of platforms specifically to handle with cybersecurity in outer space activities, both internationally and domestically. Third, there are no international platform which is comprehensively recognized to simultaneously handle with both space safety and space security issues. In other words, both civil, commercial, and military issues. There are no proper platform to make rules for the dual-use space activities, such as ADR. The coordination between city and COPUOS, the first and the fourth committee, should be more frequent, regular, and substantive. The merging of those platforms and their space-relevant functions is happening right now in one kind or another, and it would be a trend of institutional reform in space, no matter how long it will take. So the relevant institutional reform should be taken into consideration as well. The third, limited solutions to prisoner dilemma or the escalatory cycle of weaponization. So now to place weapons in outer space will be an ideal strategy for all mankind. However, in order to take advantages of strategic deterrence, each rational player in the game would pick to place weapons in outer space as a dominant strategy. The result is everyone's situation gets worse. For instance, the unreasonably and inevitably increasing military budget, as you just mentioned, and the relevant space projects. Therefore, a necessary change of space control doctrine and the due balance of national security and international interests should be taken into consideration. Besides the three limits, the deteriorating geopolitical environment is also a main challenge to non-weaponization in outer space. For instance, after Ukraine crisis, it is reported that Russia restarted some ISAT programs. And in Asia-Pacific area, along with the expanding scope of mutual protection between U.S. and Japan, from territorial attack to cyber and outer space. This mistrust and the possibilities of military conflicts with China in outer space is increasing. It shows that piracy and space security is not an isolated issue and always mirrors the tension of international politics. The geopolitical tensions could not be solved solely in space domain, but the cooperation and non-weaponization in outer space will surely benefit for trust and confidence building between powers. Moreover, it also shows that TCBM is always a critical tool in international security domain. So next I would like to talk to the solutions. The solution will be examined from 3 dimensions in this talk, including contents, method, and rationale, respectively exploring what, how, and why as to the key elements solutions. The first, the contents, about what are the solutions. The contents includes 1 crucial element, 2 mechanisms, and 3 key issues. As to the 1 crucial element, it is the TCBM. TCBM is an oft-stated phrase in arms control domain. To enhance TCBM is the prerequisite for cooperation and non-weaponization in outer space, and the objective of it as well. The level of cooperation is determined by the extent of TCBM. The TCBM GGE report in 2013 should be the most important references here. Thus, the international community should embark on, discuss, and doing research on the applicability and implementation measures of this report. As to the 2 mechanisms, referring notification and information exchanging mechanism and the dialogue mechanism. The first mechanism is targeting at information and data of 3 aspects: national or regional space policy, space object, and space activities, such as the planned launch, scheduled maneuvers in orbit, intentional breakups in orbit. Dialogue mechanism, no matter bilateral or multilateral, is necessary to undertake advanced, concerted, well thought out, effective, and timely coordinative measures between space actors. In particular, under emergent circumstances, a state could clarify information and ambiguous situations through dialogue mechanism. A dialogue mechanism always asks for specific contact information, regular meeting, and even ad hoc joint organ between states. These 2 mechanisms would promote the SSA space situational awareness and prevent mishaps, misperceptions, miscalculations, and misunderstanding in outer space. As to the 3 key legal issues, self-defense, ADR, and cybersecurity in outer space, it has raised the concerns of potential future conflicts in our space domain, object and the limits of cyber attack to space systems. So the first, as to the self-defense right in outer space, in my view, personal view, it should not be granted. It should not be granted. Because it would give rise to irreversible result, no matter it's legal or illegal one. So second, take a step back. At least we need a uniform interpretation of applicability of self-defense. For instance, if in the condition that the development of testing of dual-use technologies such as rendezvous and proximity operations and hypervelocity kinetic kill systems in some circumstances could trigger self-defense right. In other words, it should be limited in certain conditions or procedures which could be verified, also from my personal view. As to ADR, the legal basis and liability of the ADR, especially removal of non-cooperative space object, need to be discussed. As to the cybersecurity in outer space, both cyberspace and outer space is on the brink of arms race and conflict, let alone cybersecurity in outer space. Firstly, we should pursue a cybersecurity in outer space concept based on common security. Secondly, we should carefully examine the application of the existing international law and explore new international norms suits the characteristics of the cybersecurity in outer space. And as to the method, two methods are stressed here: to uphold the rule of law and to foster cooperation. First, lawmaking. As also old Chinese saying goes, nothing can be accomplished without rules or standards. China is of the view that to negotiate and conclude an international legally binding instrument is the best option to prevent weaponization and arms race in outer space. The U.S. just takes opposite position, but highlighting the importance of soft law making. Personally, I can't agree neither of them. It should be noted that both soft law making and hard law making are significant for fostering non-weaponization in outer space. Both all the PBWT, SUC, TCBMGT report, and the long-term sustainability working group, the guidelines, should be paid the same attention and value. They should be discussed without prejudice to others. Both the lawmaking and other cooperation could be achieved through bilateral, regional, multilateral, or under the UN framework. So, at last but not at least, as to the rationale, first, space development rather than space control should be taken as the primary doctrine. Self-protection and self-disciplining should be emphasized on the basis of equality and should be both reflected in rules-making process. The third, to strive for equilibrium between national interests and common interests is very important. That's all of about my talk. Any comments and questions will be welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kui, for your introductory remarks. As evident, I think from the legal perspective, there are even larger challenges, I think, when we talk about, where do we have any kind of convergence on the rules of law, as you said, and some kind of basic norms that would be acceptable for all. But actually, two things come to my mind before I open the floor to discussions. And one is actually a question for Xavier. He might elaborate, because he actually came up with a possible solution. The sharing of the space situational awareness data internationally is, I think, an idea that has been circulating for a while. But the challenges of actually how to proceed are always there. And this seems like a very pragmatic way forward, because if we are able to share independently information on activities in space, that would give us an independent way of verification activities of each other, and that would be a good starting point for any kind of discussions on instruments in even treaties. So have there been any developments, let's say, in the international venues to advance this kind of sharing?
To my knowledge, two things about it. I think first, yes, as you just suggested, Jana, making available a variety of national systems eventually lead to a collective system that is more, I would say, that can be trusted more than if you have only one system that says that this happened, that this not happen. So the fact that you had a number of countries involved in this activity of monitoring space activities is in itself a positive development, because it creates the condition for exchanges and then for collective security. I know that, for example, there are some efforts in even small steps can be the first step towards something more collective. I know, for example, that between China and the United States, there is a very thin link regarding space monitoring. I think it's something like an email address, and you can send an information or request for information. But at least the link exists, and that's something already that is important. Of course, in Europe, we're well placed to think about these things, because, as you may know, the European Union wants to promote a European-wide space surveillance and tracking system, SST, and it's based on the good willing of a number of key countries. It's not always easy to achieve these objectives, even inside Europe. And of course, as you know, again, we have a dual aspect. We have the civilian aspect. We have also the military aspect. So you need to find a data policy. You need to find a governance. Governance and data policy, by the way, are two key words in any aspect of the space activity today. Whether you're talking about maritime surveillance, whether you're talking about space surveillance, whatever, you will end up with fighting with these two notions: how to share data and how it should be governed. And this is not the least difficult things to achieve, but at least it gives a roadmap. I just suggest that such a roadmap could be enlarged to the international scene, and I'm quite convinced that, again, because we are all affected by any event in space, we are all interested in making progress in this area.
And I think also we might also discuss later what is the role of the commercial players in this field, because I think these are increasingly prominent, so maybe for later discussion. But I think Bharat here had a comment on this.
When you refer to data gathering, it's probably not only restricted to the governments and the companies, but there are also a lot of individual researchers who are out there. I think one of the examples that I could easily go out as a discussion that's happening in the other room is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty's International Monitoring System. While mandated to originally monitor nuclear tests, it monitors a wide range of information data, including volcanic eruptions, even missile testings and rocket testings. And the way that they verify the ground truth information through multiple sources is actually, they refer to Jonathan McDowell. Anybody who is in the space community knows this guy based out of Harvard's Chandra Laboratory, who monitors almost all rocket launches in the world. And if you go to the Comprehensive Test Ban Monitoring Treaty International Monitoring System website, every event that is occurred that's a rocket launch, one of the sources, validated source of information is Jonathan. So, the USGS, the United States' Geological Survey, mandated to monitor nuclear tests, was begun as an informal way of universities coming together to exchange data on earthquakes and events around the world that is tracked by seismic sensors. So there is a hope. There are initiatives such as these where sensitive data can be shared. But again, it depends on what kind of data, which data, and how much you can publicly access, and the question of funding, the scale, size, and scope. And once you've also started it, you also need to maintain it.
Thank you, Bharat. Well, I don't want to monopolize certainly the floor, so I would ask the audience for questions. We can begin right here on the left side and then continue here.
Hi, my name is Christine Leah. I'm at Yale University. Just a comment about from the perspective of a historian. What you said, Jenna, about this being the first time we have, this dual news issue about in arms control issues. Well, historically, that's absolutely false. If you look at debates in the 1920s, after the First World War, about placing limitations on European forces, there were massive disagreements about how on earth do you regulate aircraft? Military versus civilian. How on earth do you begin to do verification on different types of airplanes and so forth? And so, again, history shows these attempts failed. So I would tend to agree with you, Dr. Gopaswamy, sorry, my pronunciation, about relying perhaps more on a deterrence regime rather than an arms control regime for these kinds of issues. And yes, highlighting the dangers and difficulties of space cooperation.
Yes, I will just briefly comment. My point that I was making is that I was making a contrast in the age of the Cold War, where actually the understanding between the only two powers operating in space was such that they were able to create an atmosphere of understanding what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in space. But now in the age where there are, as I said, over 60 entities operating in space, the environment is so complex that the dual-use nature of these systems that always has been there is complicating. And unlike other perhaps terrestrial, weapon systems, space assets also provide actually benefits for civilian and other usage, which I think is in its way unique. And that's why it creates another layer of let's say, understanding in when we create some kind of governance regime. But so I think the next speakers were here in the first row, and then we can go back as it progresses.
Thank you. I believe that at present there are two proposals on the table. One is the PPWT by Russia and China, and the other one is the initiative of the European Union for a code. Now, PPWT is more ambitious, clearly, because it would be a treaty and therefore legally binding. Creates some difficulties to some countries, and we know what these countries are. It creates legal difficulties as well, because we know that the United States have difficulties in ratifying treaties in the field of international security. And this is the reason why the European Union promoted a less ambitious proposal, but which, and it goes back to 2007, when under the Bush administration, of non-legally binding engagement, which appeared as a possible common denominator for everyone. So it is true that it is not enough, but it is what appeared then, and I think appears now to be feasible. The criticism, one of the criticisms, is that it was started by like-minded countries, basically the countries of the European Union, but many initiatives of this kind, especially in the field of codes of conduct, have been developed in the same way, and they have succeeded, like the HCOC. So indeed, I think that this EU initiative still remains, although limited, the most feasible solution. And this would also probably include this interesting idea of sharing space situation data. I mean, this could be very well included into this code of conduct. There are also already some provisions regarding information, exchange of information and notification of launches and so on. So why not I mean, the proposal is open to suggestion by any country, so it's difficult to say, well, we have not been consulted. There have been many, many rounds of negotiations on that. So if there are some better solutions, I think they should be promoted and presented, but I think this is the main game in town right now. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I think we have Mr. Shang here.
Thank you. Thank you all for all the presentations today. It's very excellent ones. I have actually one question and one comment. First, the question is to Mr. Pascoe, because you made a very interesting introduction to the space security, because I really never heard it before. You distinguish it between two sides. It's intentionally and non-intentionally. But according to the treaties of the outer space, the non-intentionally seems to be relating to the coalition, also the space debris, which means it's basically for the peaceful uses of outer space. But for the intentionally, it can be interpreted, I don't know whether maybe in certain way as the space weapons, right? So it's for the military uses. So anyway, it's a very interesting criteria to distinguish them. But anyway, we still have to go back to the peaceful uses and the military uses of outer space. So I just want to, maybe if you could elaborate more on the definition of the scope of space security, because it's a very interesting topic. As Ms. Robinson also comment on that, maybe we could sum up some common elements or principles which could unite all the countries of space activities together to discuss and the topic of space security, because it's really the to ensure the space activity of all the countries. For the comment, I would like to talk a few words about the China's test in the year of 2006, because I'm now working here in the China mission to the European Union, but I used to follow the activities of the UN COPIOS, so we really discussed about this before. It's surprising that the presentation from scholar today rather like an old-fashioned representative from the USA. It's to my surprise, because that's used to be a topic between China and the USA. But nowadays, for your information, we have very good bilateral cooperation and communication between China and the USA. I would like to refer to the first China-USA dialogue on outer space affairs held in October. We all know very well the proposal from the USA, including some discussion on the space situation awareness, bilateral communication, also some multilateral cooperation under the COPIOS. So we do have a strong bilateral communication. We never talk about such kind of counter-satellite test. The second one I want to reiterate now here is that China always adheres to the principle for the peaceful uses of outer space. That's been reiterated in many occasions for many times. China is not the only one who did such kind of test. And China is not the first one to do such kind of test. As far as I know, USA has done it before. So is that activity by the USA a threat to other countries of space activities? I'm surprised why China is pointed here without mentioning other activities. It's kind of bias, I'm afraid. Thirdly, I also want to refer to latest discussion under the UN COPIOS, that's active removal of space debris. It has been discussed for several years because it's a very interesting topic. To some experts, the active removal of space debris means it's active removal of space objects. so we could say the space law and space activity really develops very fast. We are discussing about active removal now. For the last comment, I would like to refer our attention to the discussion during the first plenary this afternoon. Our distinguished Russian colleague mentioned that strategic stability is very important for non-proliferation issues. I believe it's also the same in the outer space affairs. He mentioned also the nuclear war. The possibility of a nuclear war is near zero. In my opinion, the possibility of space war is also near zero now. I didn't see the reason to create tension on purpose in space. I don't know the reason why. At last, to conclude, I just want to remind all the experts, the space technology really develops very fast recently, and also the space activities and the space law is developing to keep in pace with the development of space technology. So maybe all the experts should just keep in pace with the latest development, to open their eyes to see what's happening in the world, to learn about the current situation instead of staying in their own world. Thank you.
Thank you. I think before answering, we will take two more questions and then the speakers can react. So I think there were two, or one there, and then one on the left here.
First of all, thank you for your initial remarks and the questions already asked until now. My name is Milan Godin. I work for the Flemish dual-use export control, so part for an interest for potential end use of dual-use goods. This is not really my area. But I have a comment, and I just want to know the panel's reaction on this comment. I would like to know a bit more about actually the basis and the motivation behind the non-weaponization in space. What is used? Because currently in the Outer Space Treaty, peaceful use of outer space is the basis. But realistically, of many of the objects in near Earth orbit and geostationary orbit, while not weapon systems, they are central in both offensive and defensive military actions when it comes to communication, GPS observation. And that linked to the language, for example, the US uses, but I can imagine also Russia, in response to, for example, the Chinese test, their reaction in terms of protection of strategical assets, namely observation satellites and then satellites used for planning of military actions that might be in danger because of weaponization systems in space. This seems to be, to me, as a bit of a contradiction in putting forward as a basis of non-weaponization the peaceful use only of space. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your comments on that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Raji from Observer Research Foundation in Delhi. I had actually two finger comments on one of the points raised earlier about the global governance aspect of outer space. I agree there are two major proposals. One is the PPWT and the other one is the EU proposed ICOC. I also agree both of them have their own kind of challenges in actually making it a reality. Given the overall political trends today, I think it's extremely difficult and challenging for us to see the PPWT in reality in the short, at least in the near term. But in the meanwhile, obviously, and therefore looking at the prospects of concluding at an early date, a sort of a political commitment in the form of the ICOC. While I agree, but I think my comment is particularly when you look at and say that there's a success of HCOC in a sense. The HCOC may have about 135, 140 countries being signatories to it, but some of the critical countries are still missing in that. You do not have countries such as Iran, North Korea, China, Pakistan. None of these countries are part of the HCOC. So in a sense, the utility of the measuring of that particular measure is in question precisely because you don't have these critical countries. You may have a critical number of countries, but some of the critical actors are missing in that sense. So the utility of any such instrument then is in question right before it actually moves. So in that sense, again, the HCOC, similar to that, you don't want an ICOC that does not have some of the critical actors being party to it. So in a sense, the question is also how do you incentivize countries such as Russia, such as China, India, and all of these different parties to kind of sign on to it and see the utility of signing on to some sort of an instrument at this point of time. Again, a point that can be sort of debated by all the panelists, I would think. Second, a quick footnote kind of thing on the Chinese anti-satellite test as to why that is being singled out in a sense. I think there was a sort of moratorium for about 2 decades in a sense to anti-missile tests, anti-satellite tests, but China's 2007 anti-satellite test did bring about a fresh debate on the space security and the militarization of space or the trends towards weaponization. And I think that's possibly why the Chinese anti-satellite test gets kind of prominently discussed in all the debates. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji, for your comment. So before another question, I think I will let the speakers to react. If Xavier, would you like to start?
Thank you, Jana. Mr. Chan, you raised the bar very high. I hope I will be able to keep with the challenge as an expert. Now, this intentional, non-intentional, I just wanted to highlight the fact that space is a very specific environment. It's very different from air, sea, and earth, of course. And especially because, as you know, one of the main difficulties is how to attribute. How do you attribute an effect to a certain cause? This is a technical issue. But behind this technical issue, you have another one. Once you have attributed, okay, this collision is due to this satellite, how do you know about the intent? Was it an accident? Was it deliberate? You don't know. And it will be very difficult for years to come to know about this. So that's the reason why I think we need to be very pragmatic. And the fact that I was using this intentional versus non-intentional kind of grid of lecture was really to highlight the fact that neither the United States, nor China, nor Russia, nor, of course, Europe are able today to have the means and the capabilities to exactly know what's going on in space. But the more we know together, the better it is. So we need to be very humble, I think. And we need to be very pragmatic in the way we're proceeding. We need to go step by step. Again, this debate about the code of conduct in the United Nations was very interesting because it showed the limit of something that is very top-down, and it's a good thing that we have a political will, whether we're proposing the PPWT or if we're proposing the code of conduct, we all have a common will, that is to enhance the collective security in space. We need to base this on concrete steps, and one step could be this exchange of information. And again, you underline the fact that between the United States and China there was this kind of a link. Even if it's very modest, it seems to me, it still exists and it's very important. It needs to be improved. I think it's very important that a number of countries in the world, China, Russia, the United States, European countries, European Union by itself, can contribute to this. And I agree with you, this mechanism for information exchange was included in the Code of Conduct as in order to give a framework for this. We can invent another platform. I agree. We can have several platforms. We don't have to lose the objective. What is the end objective? The end objective to increase the trust, the mutual trust, and so to increase the information exchange. It's going to be difficult. Again, I think we should focus on the data policy issues. We should focus on the governance. A GGE, a group of governmental experts, really, in fact, highlighted this. We all agree, I think, here in this room that the GGE report is a good basis for implementing some kind of collective mechanism. So that was just, it was not I would say, a genial invention from my part. It was just a manner of giving a grid of lecture. So I just wanted to.
Thank you, Xavier. Would you like to comment?
I'll start with your comments. I think the governance aspects and the multilateral framework or the bilateral framework, I think all options are on the table. None of them, they're voted out in their current dynamic, but keep in mind, this is never a static environment. You're always making decisions in a dynamic environment, and it's a function of, keep in mind, this is also a function of geopolitics. So space is one aspect of broader geopolitics as well. So today the PPWT may not work in its current form, but who can rule out that 5, 10, 15 years later what this may be evolving to. But the bilateral cooperation, the United States or countries engage with bilateral agreements on these aspects as and when their security needs are addressed. In that point, I would like to point out the Hague Code of Conduct. The Hague Code of Conduct in its current form, not many countries sign on to it, but India and Pakistan have a moratorium on missile test notification, which is inherent, which is actually an idea they come out from the Hague Code of Conduct, but they strictly follow, both countries strictly follow that specific guideline because that addresses a specific security interest that both can adhere to. So the next thing about my Chinese colleague, I will actually take it as a compliment that I am probably a U.S. representative. I could assume my hat as a U.S. representative, which means I also get my information from all sources and not one specific source. So an aggregation of all the sources, speaking to various people in the think tank community, in the intelligence community, in the DoD community, in the State Department, my colleagues elsewhere outside in India, Japan, Australia, even in China. I think what I've summarized reflects a broad consensus on the contours of the debate. Yes, you may think I may not live in a different world, but the discussions as of last week still reflect much of these things. It's not about what's said in the public domain, it's more about what's unsaid in the public domain. That needs to be highlighted, that needs to be said too. And a bulk of these debates are still a reflection of stronger politicized debates in the international, in Washington as well as elsewhere. And to your comment about the language, that's actually my second scenario, which I did not highlight. I think I disagree with the way that it's also framed. If the debate in Washington is about challenging American primacy in space in Western Pacific, the United States policymakers need to be concerned about. I agree with that, but only to the extent they need to be concerned about that. For example, something happens in Western Pacific tomorrow to any of the American space assets, the American will be blinded temporarily, blinded or will be deaf temporarily, but it will not be a permanent damage. And there are numerous studies that have shown that America can compensate for a temporary degradation or denial in any of their space assets. But that's only temporary. That makes the cost of U.S. conflict riskier and more expensive. But when it comes to escalation control or targeting nuclear assets that affect strategic stability, I think the argument there is overstated. I agree with you. That's an ill-founded composition, and that's a lazy framework that's been borrowed from somewhere else.
Thank you, Bharat. Koi, would you like to comment?
Yes. First, I would like to talk about the relations between the ICOC and the PPWT, as you mentioned. And then I would like to talk some short comments about the PPWT and the asset. So first, I think that besides the legal effect, ICOC and the PPWT is also totally different. They are in different level. I mentioned that the two core elements about the space security is arms control and space debris. Apparently that the PPWT just targeting at the first one, and the ICOC, of course, not only limited to the space debris issues, but much relevant to the space debris issue. It's all about the transparency, about data exchange, about the SSA. So there are different products, legal products. And in the very latest round in New York, so it seems that because EU expressed that the decision will be made by vote, but at last, there's no substantive outcome there. So some people said that the EU suffered like a setback again. But as to me, I think that's not necessarily the case. So next, I would like to talk very short comments about the prospects or the future of the ICOC. First, I think that the EU already successfully draw international community's attention to the ICOC, and its power of discourse in space norms making or even space order making are highly increasing. The second, even it's beyond UN system, but the international community found a possible way out to provide new space norms catering for the huge demands about space safety and security, accordance which in terms of the dialogue in CD and the Copious. And the third, in essence, the ICOC containing both civil and military use norms is in accordance with the nature, the essence of the dual-use space activities. So it means that when it's getting mandate, what I think the EU right now is doing, from UN and delete the article of self-defense, actually accept the procedural issues. The most important obstacle of the ICOC is the self-defense articles, the 4.2. Just the overall, the very comprehensive concerns of the international community. So it has to be noted that the original text of ICOC, the COC, actually, as you mentioned, 2007, does not mention the self-defense even in the word. So in my personal view, being endorsed by United Nations, like you said, as the HCOC, was the original and might be the final strategic intention of EU, just as my personal observation here. And second, I will talk something about the PPWT, the leader is there. And hold on a second, please. Actually, as the U.S. delegation pointed out that there are several gaps in the PPWT does not address, even in the latest draft. The absence of addressing ground-based asset, the lack of verification mechanism, and the absence of regulation on space debris issue. And I think we can talk about it from the four perspectives. The first, asset, personally, I would like to say, is a big threat to space security, especially when it generates mass space debris and stay in outer space. I think in respect of this, this argument just reflect the popular concern, especially from like private sectors, commercial space actors. And the second one, also another two concerns should be acknowledged here. One concern is that both the placement of weapon in outer space and asset are tools to protect national security and obtain strategic deterrence, just like that gentleman's question, why just the people, to develop the placement of weapon in outer space. The other concern is that to which extent they could be as such tools, and what will be the result of a considerate, comprehensive cost-benefit calculation of those activities in the long term. So I think maybe it's not from a space lawyer or a policy analysis perspective. We need a more higher or a comprehensive level to do the research about what is the most important element to protect national security, to place weapons in outer space, to develop the cyber attack technology, or develop the drone technology in the near Earth, near space. So it's still there's no conclusion here. And about the asset, as the colleague from China mentioned that both U.S. and Russia has conducted dozens of the asset before 2007. And as a scholar mentioned that anti-satellite weapons may have been the only method to achieve space control in the early decades of space exploitation. The last point, in my personal view, I think it might be practical to consider a soft code of conduct in which both addressing prevention of place weapons in outer space and the prevention of asset with generating long-existing space debris should be stipulated in such kind of code. That might be a way out. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. I think we have one last question from the audience, and I would ask for a brief question and hopefully brief answers because we have some few minutes left. So please, there is one.
Thank you, Jiang Kang from King's College London. So the question is for the panelists. So first one is, if we are look back at Americans' decisions to allow non-governmental entities to go into the business of imaginary providers from orbital entities, from orbital developments, does it change the balance of force in terms of space security? Because does it, for one side, doing something good because it provide multiple access equipments, not only the government one, but multiple ones, so it increased the difficulties of attack? Or on the other hand, it's not very good because it made the regulations or made the enhancement of protective measures much more difficult because there are more and more players there now. This is a very big scenario that's very similar to the cyber things because you have multiple players now. The improvement of defensive measures become far more difficult. So what's your assessment of whether a government should increase non-governmental ownership of sensitive technology in this way? The second question, is also very short, is if we are really talking about a unilateral or deterrence-based strategy for space security, does it give a significant challenge to current declaratory policy, primarily for the West, or basically for every country? Because there's no any admission of offensive space capability currently, which I personally think is a good thing because it shows the norm, kind of. But if you are really going forward for a deterrence-based strategy to solve security problems, that you have to admit or signal somehow you do have retaliatory capability.
Thank you for your questions. Xavier, would you like to start with quick?
Very quickly, as far as the first part of your question is concerned, I quite agree with you. In fact, the main challenge of what we're talking about today is to make sure that space security is compatible with the space activity development. In fact, the real problem has always been for any regime, control regime, transparency regime, is to make sure that when you increase the security in one environment, it's not done at the detriment of the economic activity as a whole. You're right to point out the fact that the United States were the first to allow this development. But as you may know, as you surely know, the fact that satellites are becoming more and more elaborated and smaller and more affordable would have anyway, whenever the time allowed the private industry to, I would say, go into space. So let's fact the situation where we will have more and more private enterprise, private actors in space, and we have to integrate that. One interesting issue has been in this field of SSA that the geostationary operators have grouped into an organization that you may know. It's called Space Data Association. In fact, as a matter of fact, they contribute to SSA because they first exchange between each other about their respective position of their respective fleets, but they also contribute to the information of governments, which is a good thing. Again, here, but it's like for any perspective of exchanging intergovernmental data, the key issue is data policy. How do you regulate? Who is regulating? And once you have answered these questions, it's not a problem per se. There's no intrinsic problem in having the private actors being more and more active in space. They have to be certainly regulated in a transparent way and in a good governance scheme. By the way, it gives me the opportunity to say that these kind of topics could well be a good topics for discussion for future international reflection. As far as deterrence is concerned, I wouldn't follow you on the fact that if we're talking about deterrence, it means that we have offensive weapons in space. I mean, deterrence is, for example, about attribution. If I know who did something, it's the beginning of deterrence. It doesn't mean that I have something to retaliate, but at least I can tell you that I know, and I will be in possibility to demonstrate that there has been some troubles. I just take one example. As you may know, Eutelsat for years has been jammed over some regions. And as you may know also, the ITU now, which is the organization that deals with these telecommunication regulations, has evolved on these topics by finally finding a way to implement a system that will be, and that is, internationally recognized, that can pinpoint the origin of a jamming activity. I can tell you that for months already, there is no jamming anymore, almost. Also for other reasons, for political reasons, but not only. The fact that you have a system that makes you in a position to demonstrate that the origin of a problem is this or this country, does create a new relationship, a new framework. I think when we talk about space deterrence, this is a term that has been floating around for years and months. I think we need to deconstruct this and see what are the steps, what does it mean in space, what does it mean as a whole, and what does it mean in space. In space already it means I know better than before how to attribute certain cause to certain effects. I think we just need to think about this first. We're not talking about offensive weapons. It seems to me it's a personal judgment.
Thank you, Xavier. If the other two speakers would like to react very briefly, because we are just about at time to conclude.
I think both your questions are not a brief reaction questions. The first one, I think, if I understand it correctly, we have a lot of validation parameters like the top secret clearance. Even non-governmental entities who are working on some of these sensitive issues are subject to going through specific checks and balances in the system, such as giving security clearance access to many NGOs in the United States. And unfortunately, a good few of them are eligible, a good few of them are not eligible. So as long as there is a checks and balances in the system and what your intentions can be to a reasonable degree verified, that's fine. The deterrence question, I got to have a beer with you and discuss that because it's a very long question.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank the speakers. I think we have... actually I would like to conclude on a positive note. So I think what we could conclude today that a way forward should be to look at the pragmatic steps and actually the technical capabilities that will allow us to set up some governance systems. So more sharing in the space situational awareness arena, I think that's a step that I think all nations can agree upon. And as actually Mr. Shankir pointed out, that the work in the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space is there already on this particular topic. So I think that there are already bottom-up initiatives that started to deal with it some time ago. And again, I think we all here kind of could agree that among the basic cooperative mechanisms that are true for other domains is basically the information and notification, which can be also done unilaterally. So that's a good point. If a nation can want to be transparent, they can start unilaterally and then expand it bilaterally and even multilaterally, and then consultations. So I think these are good bottom lines for transparency and confidence building measures for outer space activities. So with this, I will conclude the panel, and thank you everyone for attending, and I look forward to future exchanges.